This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship,
about engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues
and how to have a voice in what happens next.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. Today we have the great opportunity to talk about a topic that's pervading our news and pervading many of our fears, and a topic with a long and rich history, but a history that very few people know about. It's the history not just of pandemics, but the history of what we might call pandemic persistence, how pandemics that begin and cause great harm linger long after people think that they are through the danger. They go in what many call waves, second and third waves. And there's a human tendency to want to get through the crisis and reach the other side, to be done with it. And today we're dealing with the challenges of recognizing that we're not done with the pandemic we've confronted. And this is an old dilemma, an old challenge. And we're so fortunate to have with us a good friend, a wonderful scholar, a mensch, Chris McKnight Nichols. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
Chris is a very distinguished scholar. He's the director of the Center for the Humanities at Oregon State University. He's also the Sandy and Elva Sanders Eminent Professor in the Honors College there. He is an Andrew Carnegie Fellow, which is really quite a distinction. And he's best known for a book that I know all of my students have been forced to read. Hopefully they've enjoyed reading it. Promise and Peril, America at the Dawn of a Global Age, which is really about the late 19th, early 20th century, and the debates between various forms of isolationism and internationalism. And Chris gets us beyond the sort of false dichotomies we often have about these terms. He's the author and editor of 5 other books. The most recently published one is a fantastic book, Rethinking American Grand Strategy. What does it mean to be a strategically focused society? What does it mean to have a strategic dialogue in the world we're in today? How can history help? And he has a new book coming out on ideologies, or ideas, and U.S. foreign relations. The title is Ideologies and U.S. Foreign Relations, New Histories. I'm lucky to have a chapter in this book. It's a really wonderful collection that Chris has put together of different ways of understanding how ideas influence American policy. Most recently, Chris has spent, I think, much of the last year or so doing a lot of research on this period he knows so well, the early 20th century, the period in particular around the influenza pandemic of 1918, 1919, and what we can learn for today. So, Chris, we're really excited to hear your insights about all of these issues. Before we turn to Chris, though, we have, of course, our opening poem from Mr. Zachary Siri. What's the title of your poem today, Zachary?
This Peaceful Dawn.
I love it. We have Chris's book, Global Dawn, and we have your poem, Peaceful Dawn. Let's hear your dawn.
This peaceful dawn. They say the earth rotates upon an axis, a spinning world, a gentle hum. They say the earth is never still. I say it's like a pendulum. Look, it swings upon a string. At the ends, it stops a beat, all gone of pain and death and fear. But back it folds into the curve and ends the cursory retreat. Hark over yonder where the Duke of York assembles dying men upon the hill. When they're up, they're flying. When they're down, death's had its fill. And when they're only halfway up, they're flightless yet not gone. But times like these are fleeting. Quite short, this peaceful dawn.
Zachary, I have to say, among other things, I am impressed with how you worked the Duke of York into your poem. When you're up, and when you're down, you're down. What is your poem about?
My poem is really about the very strange emotional nature of this pandemic and the ways in which it's become like a pendulum, where we feel like we finally reached a moment of peace, and it's so fleeting. And we go right back down into that swing of destruction and death and pain.
Right. We swing in 2 directions, right?
Yeah.
Chris, is that a helpful way to think about how societies in the past, how Americans and others have grappled with the persistence of a pandemic?
I think it is, in particular, the line, times like this are fleeting. It does seem that time sort of speeds up and slows down simultaneously in a pandemic. And certainly, the experience of the 1918 pandemic, if you look at sort of social histories, diaries, letters to the editor, that sort of kind of evidence, you see people first, largely putting it off, thinking of the flu pandemic, the first wave, which we'll be getting into, I think, a bit more, as just a 3-day fever, a new name for an old disease, and then suddenly, when it comes back and it's more virulent, people get very upset, very scared. There are problems with information, and time sort of slowed down then as people quarantined, and there were other kinds of non-pharmaceutical interventions and social distancing and all that sort of stuff. And then again, sort of this sense, you would say afterwards, speeding up our story, of a kind of amnesia about what had just happened. Now, it wasn't like the trauma wasn't there. It was very much with folks in the 1920s, and we can see it in the historical record much more clearly than people have sometimes suggested. But it had passed by, and so the pendulum swung several times through, and then there was this sort of compulsion across many societies to move on, even though they'd been so devastated. So I think the poem actually encapsulates a lot of the lived experience of going through a pandemic.
That's so helpful, Chris. And maybe starting at the beginning, the first wave in 1918, a lot has been recently written about this. After ignoring it for a long time, we all came back to it as this historical moment. One of the unique things I know you focused on are the varied reactions to it. How can we think about and understand the ways in which people reacted at that time to the part of this pandemic we've already been through, that first wave?
Yeah. So, the first part of the story that historians and really anyone thinking about how to map on the past to the present needs to understand is that the World War I context was dominant for what was going on then. So if you think about how governments responded or citizens responded, or the ways in which rhetoric could be made persuasive to urge people to take public health measures, all of that occurred in the milieu of a world war, of a particularly devastating one if you're in Europe, and one that the U.S. entered into quite late. So the U.S. doesn't come to the war until April 1917. The first wave of the pandemic is really February, March is when it begins. Now, there's some different kinds of debates over where it comes from, but we can trace very clearly influenza coming out of Kansas, traveling along U.S. troop lines through railroad and through shipping across the Atlantic to Europe in April and May 1918. And then you can see it go around the world, in fact, so that you have influenza reaching Shanghai towards the end of May, and you saw it in Sydney and elsewhere by June. And so it had kind of gone around the world. But what was different in that moment, which isn't quite like ours, so the parallels are imperfect, was that the case fatality rates were much lower. It was much more mild, that viral pandemic in that moment. And so the governments that were responding to this, particularly the governments that were at war, they had significant incentives to underplay what was going on. And because deaths weren't so bad, that didn't seem as irresponsible as it now might. So a couple of the key data points here, probably listeners are aware of this, but it becomes known as the Spanish flu in part because the censored press in the U.S., in Britain, in France, in Germany, in Russia, the censored press in the war keeps information about the flu away from folks. But when the Spanish king comes down with the flu and Spain's a neutral in the war, when they're reporting on it, it becomes known as the Spanish flu in that moment and weaponized as a kind of racist political language, because the Anglo-American press seizes on the Spanish as having, you can find this, you can Google some of these stories, having bad hygiene and bad climate, and those were the contributing factors to why Spain had rampant outbreaks. So that's one of the ways in which you see a kind of response, a sort of nationalist, politicized wartime rhetoric. And then, just as a data point about the deaths in that moment, the British Navy had about 10,000 sailors go be hospitalized due to the flu, but only about 4 were reported to die in that period. That's the first wave. Second wave, far more deadly. You're seeing something like 5% of troops who get it die. You see bases overwhelmed. In the U.S. So we can talk more about the second wave and kind of what that maybe suggests for the moment. But the month of October alone, 200,000 Americans die, and a population about a third the size of our current one. Just absolutely devastating.
Wow. And Chris, when we talk about the first wave and the second wave, what do we really mean? And if we're in a second wave now, how can that past experience help us understand where we are today?
Yeah, it's a good point for us to consider. What is a wave? Epidemiologists, public health scholars, and others, disagree a little bit on this language and whether or not a wave is the best way to think about it. But generally speaking, if you're thinking about the pandemics of the past, the waves represent moments of mutation, usually. And as viruses mutate, they don't necessarily have any direction. There's no teleology to viruses, right? They don't necessarily want to become more, deadly or anything along those lines. They just mutate. And so the waves are part of that, are part of those, kind of naturally occurring mutations in the virus, and then how they spread through different infected populations. So the first wave in 1918 is this somewhat more mild influenza that goes around the world within just a short number of months. That's the spring of 1918. Then we know, again, because of the wartime context and really good data analysis, where and how the second wave moves. And it comes, you see it in documents, particularly U.S. intelligence documents. You can find warnings of this is really bad, blaring, red alert kinds of warnings to the U.S. military, to the British, saying that this is going to affect the war effort in August 1918. And then that more virulent second wave comes back across the Atlantic. You can watch it travel on troop transports. It comes to Boston. And Camp Devens outside Boston is absolutely devastated. And then you can watch it through the military records travel along the East Coast. It goes by ship to Philadelphia. They have this famous outbreak, terrible outbreak, where their public health officials allow a big parade, the biggest parade to date in Philadelphia, to go on, a Liberty Loan Drive wartime parade that becomes a real super spreader event. And it's not now just infections, it's deaths. And you have deaths mounting. The horse-drawn carriages that priests were traveling through simply couldn't keep up with the amount of bodies. Something like 12,000 Philadelphians died just in about 6 weeks alone. It just really devastates the city. And that's the kind of thing we were trying to prevent in April, May, June of 2020, when people who knew about this past public health said, this is what flattening the curve is about. Don't interact with people. Don't have big events. Don't have football games. Don't have parades. Because look what happened in Philadelphia in September 1918. These sorts of super spreader events are something we can prevent for sure. It doesn't take any modern medical knowledge, and we have historical precedents that suggest how bad this is. And you can think about this again, even in the present, with our numbers of unvaccinated folks. Like, is it a good idea to have 60,000 people at a football stadium? Should they be vaccinated? These are important kinds of questions for public health, because if for no other reason, there are a number of reasons, but one reason would be overwhelming the public health infrastructure affects all of us equally, right? If you have a heart attack, if your child needs surgery, they're still left out of the public health infrastructure if the hospitals are overwhelmed with COVID cases. And you saw something like that with a much lower level of public health infrastructure in 1918, where hospitals were overwhelmed. And a really important data point then is that nurses and doctors had been drafted into the military. And so there was an enormous shortage of public health staff, which exacerbated that crisis. And then just recapping the waves. The third wave is generally thought of as occurring in winter and spring 1919. Now, this is contingent around the world. I've been focusing on the U.S., but it depends where you look. So that wave in the rest of the world sometimes spread all the way into the summer or even into the fall of 1919. And then generally speaking, and that wasn't as bad as the second wave in the fall, though it was far more deadly than that first wave. And it seems to have been the continuation of that mutated, more virulent form of the influenza that we saw in the fall of 1918. And that was stopped as it burned through populations and by non-pharmaceutical interventions like closure policies and distancing and all that sort of stuff. And then generally speaking, public health scholars say that there, rather than a fourth wave, although you sometimes will see that reported, the flu becomes endemic after 1919. That is, we live with a seasonal flu. It's the thing that we've all grown up with to some extent, getting your flu shot, that kind of thing. And that's what most public health scholars expect will happen with coronavirus.
So was there the kind of blowback and misinformation spread during the pandemic that we see today? Did that play a role in the furtherance of second, third, fourth wave?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, so one of the things that struck me, I started researching this years and years ago when I was thinking about the intersection of domestic and foreign policy in the U.S. and the World War I context. And one of the things that was really striking to me was the way that, one, governments minimized the threat of the flu. It was clear, if you're looking at the sources from individual people, that they were worried about the flu and that the flu was affecting families in the first wave and really hurting people in the second wave and killing folks. But the health officials, the U.S. Surgeon General Rupert Blue, for instance, consistently says that it's not so bad. And there's a lot of conflicting information that comes from the higher level folks, like federal folks. Woodrow Wilson, for instance, famously and infamously never once in public mentions the influenza pandemic, not once. And you have something like one or two scattered references in all of his works, letters, and private correspondence. So, at that level, that's striking. In terms of blowback and misinformation, it's amazing to look at the press from that era. You find things like, is one of my favorites that I love to teach, are ads about what will help people. Continuous smoking will stop you from getting it. That's a great one. Or another one is beware the telephone. You can get the flu through that. Druggist recommends Vicks VapoRub, and limit the amount of people who can buy it. And it looks like, some of the producers of different kinds of home remedies and things like that, we're hawking them in all kinds of ways and drumming up support for their products, saying, there's been a run on Vicks VapoRub, druggists can only sell, one per customer, that kind of thing. The other piece of the puzzle that I think is a little bit more like what we've lived through, and that, obviously we've seen quack medicine and conspiracy theories, but were abundant then. But another piece of the blowback in that era that I think gets at your poem, Zachary, is people were afraid. So getting mixed messages from government, getting this misinformation or lack of clear medical information in an era when people thought, hey, modern medicine was curing things. If you look at the Philadelphia Inquirer, you'll find they say, modern nursing halts epidemic, right as that Philadelphia second wave is crashing over the city and the city is really struggling. What are people to do? And one of the things you find in their letters, one of the things you find in Red Cross reports after, is that people literally starved to death in their homes because their neighbors wouldn't help them. They were that afraid of getting the flu. Things that they normally would have done just years before. You could have relied on your relatives. There's some searing stories of, a sister not helping a brother and their children because they were so afraid. And that's the sort of thing we felt before. And I think a lot of people are still struggling with that fear and risk assessment, right now, today. And they're likely to keep feeling that in some ways because of the measures that we've had and the lack of clear, coherent, real-time, honest information.
It seems to me, Chris, that building on these really insightful points, it seems to me that the fear cuts in two directions, right? On the one hand, there's a kind of sheltering reaction that can lead us to not help our neighbors, right, as you described so well. On the other hand, there can also be a sense of fatalism, right? This is going the direction it's going. I've been sheltering at home. I've stayed away from work for so long. I can't do this forever. I've got to get back to my life. I've got to go. I've got to move on. We seem to be hearing that a lot today. Were there similar reactions in 1918, 1919? And what can we learn from those reactions to understand what we're seeing today?
Yeah, so one of my favorite quotes about this, I've written a little bit about the experience of different cities. And there's some great analysis out there if people are interested. There's something called the Influenza Archive at the University of Michigan that has a city-by-city analysis of how they dealt with the pandemic. But one of my favorite quotes was from a Portland, Oregon health commissioner in February 1919, which strikes me as getting at some of what you were just mentioning. And he argued the biggest thing we've had to fight in the influenza epidemic has been apathy or perhaps the careless selfishness of the public. that gets at a lot of how we've seen things progressing, right? We've got those who've been very serious and rigorous and self-sacrificing, and others who have not or are unwilling to do that. And then those who felt like they sacrificed enough, right? A sufficient amount. And in the historical record, you see that in a number of places. San Francisco was known as the mask city. It had one of the strictest mask mandates. I think some folks in the press have overemphasized the blowback to that. There was the anti-mask league there. That was the one really big example, but it was only 4,000 or 5,000 self-reported people involved in that league pushing back against masks. There are isolated cases across the U.S. who pushed back against masks, but rather than thinking about it as a political push or significant organized movement, I think that quote from the health official is better. It's sort of lots of individual decisions, people in different ways getting fed up with some of the hardships of trying to do your best in a pandemic or not. And so you see there's some fantastic photos in 1918, 1919 of people throwing their masks in the air when the mandates come off, or rushing out into the streets in November 1918, even though the pandemic was still on, because the war had ended. They wanted to celebrate. They wanted to gather. Those turned out to be super spreader events, but they couldn't be stopped. Public health officials had a really hard time with that. So what are some of the lessons of that? I mean, one clear one is that people want to gather and resume their lives as normal. And so, public health officials need to figure out how you can allow as much of that as possible with a reasonable risk assessment. So it's pretty clear from data like from 1918 and 1919 that gradual reopening is the way to go, led by real-time data. So if you see infections and hospitalizations going up, you need to begin to slow down. You don't want to open up totally all at once. That's a very clear lesson from every place we have good data from 1918 and 19, including not just the U.S. So that's one piece of the puzzle. But how to get people out there doing things, this gets at the underlying personal element here is really important. The other piece of that, which we haven't yet really touched on, is the politicization.
Right.
One thing that strikes me today that is very different is that though there were politics of the pandemic in 1918 and 19, it did not map onto parties. Both parties in the midterm elections, which they were able to hold in fall 1918, even with a raging pandemic, both parties used the politics of the pandemic to say, hey, the other one has prioritized different interests in the public health measures. But neither one said that all the public health measures were due to, some kind of false sense of the medical needs of the moment or some kind of political rhetoric that was advantageous only to the party and not actually serving the interests of the people. So what that devolved down to was, hey, did you prioritize saloons or churches, basically? And then that mapped onto ethnic politics and religious politics within parties in different regions. So it wasn't as simple as it is now. And that's it. But that is an enormous difference because we're still living with, and we may never be able to get out from under the politicization of public health measures, which really seem to have hamstrung the U.S. and frankly, lots of other countries in unpredicted and somewhat unpredictable ways from the historical record.
Right. And how, Chris, do you think the vaccines, which are new and extraordinary, how they interplay with this story? How does that change our narrative today? And what echoes do you see despite the difference between a vaccinated or partially vaccinated population today and obviously a non-vaccinated population in 1918, 1919?
Yeah. So, one thing that's interesting from the 1918 moment is that there was a rush to get effective vaccines out there, right? There's a long history of inoculations in U.S. history. I like to note this, right? George Washington famously, inoculated, had all incoming Revolutionary War troops inoculated against smallpox. He was a real believer in this. He himself had smallpox. Ben Franklin, famously lamented that he didn't get his son inoculated and his son died. So there's a long American tradition of vaccination, you might call it. Inoculation, vaccination, somewhat different, but in any case, close enough for us to call that tradition. And in 1918, there was a push to get effective vaccines, and you actually saw them raced across the country. You saw mass inoculations of military personnel, but then they turned out to be not effective at all, basically. But there was this effort to mount, a robust medical R&D, mission to prevent and stem the disease any further. So what's amazing in this moment, what we were all talking about last year was, could this be the fastest global race to an effective vaccine in, the history of science, in the history of humanity? And the answer is yes. And so then it is so striking that the second stage there is that many American citizens, but others around the world, for a wide variety of reasons, aren't taking up the vaccine. That's astonishing in world historical proportions, and is sort of worth just pausing to reflect on. That, in my view as a historian, Woodrow Wilson would have ordered mass vaccinations if they'd been proven effective, or would have tried to do so. That there would be Federalist questions there. Americans very much wanted an effective vaccine in 1918. So what's changed in the last 102, 103 years?
And what do you think, Chris?
I'm hoping you can answer that, Jeremy.
Well, I mean, to me, I'll put something out there for you as more of an expert to on this issue to chew on. It does seem to me, Chris, that one of the big differences is that people do believe they can keep themselves safe and are less dependent upon the community around them. They underplay how their lives interact with others. You stated this so clearly when you talked about how the healthcare system affects all of us, whether we have COVID or something else. We can get sick with an ancillary disease and get poorer treatment as a consequence of the system being overrun. But I don't think a lot of people think that way. The same way they think they can school their kids and not worry about the public school system, I think many people think they can, one way or another, keep their family safe and not worry about others.
Man, I buy that. I think that's a good way to put it. There's a mixed with that is a sense that every person their own doctor, right? WebMD will help me solve this
Right.
or figure this out. Maybe you have a different source of information. So that's maybe perhaps you're buying the conspiracy theories, or you have a different media outlet that you're listening to. There were just far fewer of those in 1918. That's a piece of the puzzle. I think one that I've been toying with, in recent years of recent months of this pandemic, but recent years, has been the change in how Americans in particular think about sacrifice and sacrifice for the collective good. And I don't want to overplay, American willingness to sacrifice in the past, but it does seem like the sort of individualist ethos that you're describing does factor into this, and that people were more willing. Particularly at the local and state level, where all the action was in pandemic public health in 1918 and 19, citizens were willing to abide by those measures, more or less, in ways that we have not seen quite as much. Although I think, to be very fair, when the future histories of this moment are written, it could be that we wind up saying the vast majority actually did agree to those measures and did sacrifice for the public good. So a question of sort of how much sacrifice is the real issue. And I think that's where we're seeing this individualist ethos manifest itself in some of the ways you were laying out. I also think that we've become complacent about kind of modern medicine and modern science in really subtle ways. One of the big things going on in the early 20th century was a kind of rise of science, this sense in the progressive era of the perfectibility of man and his institutions. That's the kind of language that they used then, and the ways in which modern science was leading the way, the social sciences as well. And then history was thought of as a social science. And so that one of the challenges of that pandemic was that it cast into sharp relief some of the false promises or unfulfilled promises of modern medicine. It simply couldn't stop 650,000 Americans, 75,000 Americans from dying, and maybe as many as 50 million people around the world. Modern medicine wasn't up to the task. Right now, modern R&D medicine has been, amazingly, with vaccines at least, although not with treatments yet, really fully for COVID. Why are we taking that for granted? That seems to be a piece of this era that we're complacent about the miraculous capabilities of modern science.
I think there's also this false sense that that every opinion is valid, and that there can never be just one actual factual scientific response, right? That you might have your science and your medicine, but I as the individual get to have my separate opinion, and you have to respect that in a way that I don't think people are willing to accept the sort of accepted belief without first sort of formulating their own opinion, even though they don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah, I buy that. I think, one thing that's interesting about the Wilson moment is it cuts both ways there. Wilson famously started his Committee on Public Information, and one of the famous things that the muckraker, George Creel, who was the head of that, said that there's sort of no difference between truth and lies except, in the power of those ideas to persuade. And that was kind of what the wartime state was all about in World War I. And in that era, the progressives did make the argument that you just made, that there is something really fundamentally important about truth and facts. And yet these progressive journalists who were tasked with promoting patriotism and sacrifice during the war played fast and loose with those. So, maybe we live with a long legacy of some of the modern bureaucratic ways in which states function, which is to say that there's less difference between truth and lies in the politics of sort of entering into the social arena, entering into the political arena, that Teddy Roosevelt square.
Sure. And I think, Chris, one of the challenges as well is these are complex issues. And it is understandable that someone who has gone through the vaccination regimen, as most of us have, and I hope everyone listening gets their vaccines, it is understandable that someone who's gone through that, and some people, of course, were not comfortable with that process, but did it anyway. They did the right thing. They now feel like, wait a second, I've done this. Why should I have to wear a mask? Why should I have to go through these procedures? And of course they should. It's still important not to spread the virus, even if you are vaccinated. But that's a complicated narrative to spin out, right? It's not about just doing one thing or just doing a few things. And again, there is the way in which this persists. I've heard a number of students say and colleagues say, we're now into a year and a half of this. How long do I have to speak to people through a mask? How long do I have to go get curbside instead of eating at the restaurant I want to eat in? And I guess my question for you, Chris, in addition to your reflections on that, is what worked in 1918, 1919? Clearly, the effects of the influenza pandemic were devastating on the United States and the world. More Americans died from influenza than from the war, which is astounding. But yet, society went forward. And as I think is true today, the majority of the people complied and did the right things. What helped people get through this over that long period, which I think was so much more difficult then because they didn't have the internet and they didn't have credit cards? How did they do it?
Yeah. Well, so the first point I think is a great one, right? The pandemic persistence. One element that I like to emphasize in thinking about pieces of persistence then is that the U.S. public health infrastructure had basically no policymaking power. It was state, county, city governments that really determined responses to the pandemic, how long things stayed on, whether or not there were mandates or recommendations, all that sort of stuff. That's really where the action was. And that has remained true. The states and cities, counties that we've seen do well on this pandemic, got out in front of it, had good public health messaging, and confronted the reality of what you just so aptly put, right? This is complicated. This is changing. Remember March of 2020, people thought transmission happened through packages. If you were at all concerned about that, you might have been wearing gloves. You might have been wiping down things coming into your house. You might have been wearing gloves and masked and wiping things down and all kinds of things, depending on your view of that. That changed rapidly, right? And so did sort of CDC guidelines on masks. And leaving aside the politics of that, the reality of the underlying science, this question of is there a singular answer, is that there may be in any given moment some good answers, provisional answers, but they're changing. And that's really unsatisfying. That's that pendulum swinging that Zachary was talking about, because at some point you want to take that mask off. And so maybe you can find some evidence, or maybe the evidence on masking is changing as it is right now as we record this, right? That, even vaccinated people are being recommended to wear masks inside. But perhaps we don't want to. We're finally happy to not be doing that, those of us who've been, as diligent as possible, or maybe double masking. So that's unsatisfying. But, the question of where public health responses operate best and are most effective, I think is a really important one. And I think it's very clear from the historical record and what's happened recently that local is where the action is at. And that's where we need to focus our efforts at communicating good knowledge about those complex issues. And I think for us, the two of us in university complexes, and in schools, that's about being honest and open about what we know and what we don't know and not pretending to have all the answers. So that's one part. So in the second part of the question, sort of what worked, well, a couple pieces of this. One thing that I've been surprised at, and the fellow scholars of the flu pandemic of 1918 have as well, is that we all expected the flu to become endemic, or the coronavirus to become endemic around now or in the next year, which it is becoming. But we didn't expect this second wave, and this is where we started our conversation. That the virus is ahead of us on mutations. That Delta is here. It's far more infectious. Is it 50% more? Is it 100% more? It's more virulent, so that it seems to be having higher infection and bad disease outcomes. So who's to say there won't be another wave and another mutation? Will it be better? Will it be worse? We can't know. But fortunately for those living in 1918 and 19, the most virulent wave was that second wave in fall 1918. And even though there were still a lot of deaths and suffering in winter and spring 1919, it had been burning through populations, so that by 1920, you've got a seasonal flu that's still pretty bad. Let's be honest. A lot of people are still dying of the flu, but it's nowhere near as bad, with none of the public health measures being taken that we'd seen before. But lots of local areas, if you go to local records in counties and cities, they're still analyzing what happened in 1918 and 19, in 1920 and 21, and they're trying to figure out when to throw on protocols like non-pharmaceutical interventions, closing schools and social distancing and even masking when the flu is coming around. And I think for me, one of the lessons of that moment is that we all need to be setting our expectations right. That is to say, it is probably not reasonable to set expectations of no masking, just hanging out, business as usual, normal life, anytime soon. And that's hard to say, and it's really harder to take on board. But that lesson of 1918 to 19 to 20 to 21 is that virus, infectious diseases, know no borders and mutate rapidly. And so good public health starts with citizens. It starts with that quote that I was saying, let's not be carelessly selfish. Let's all take a role in this. That's sort of what you were saying about let's all get our vaccines. So one of the things that worked was that, local officials kept their eye on the data to try to figure out how to stop it from spreading when it did show up. So when you saw some flu cases in a major city like Dallas in 1920, they're ready to throw on provisions. They've got nurses ready to go. They now have a better sense of what treatment will work. And I think that's the kind of thing we're going to see in the near term. Historians know better than to do too much predicting, but that seems like the kind of thing that helped setting expectations better when people came out on the other side of all that fear that we were talking about earlier.
It's such a good point, and I think one of the things that comes out so well in your research and your recounting of it, Chris, is that there are no simple moments when you can say we're finished or when it's safe to go back to life as before. But that doesn't mean that everything has to be locked down. There's a lot in between locking down society fully and opening up fully. And too much of our discussion is this dichotomy. Are we opening society or are we keeping it closed? When in reality, what you're describing is much more case-by-case adaptation at the local level to the conditions at that moment, which might mean opening schools, but not necessarily for a certain group, or requiring masks at schools, but not just keeping schools closed or keeping them fully open. There's a lot in between. And in a way, it seems to me that's a theme of democracy throughout our podcast, right? Which is that the simple statements that sound politically powerful don't match up with the historical realities. It seems to me that's what you're describing, Chris.
I think you're so right. And, I'll double down on that comment to say, one of the things we saw in the pandemic and we continue to see, which is really insidious, is this false binary between the health of the economy and public health. And you saw this very much in the debates of 1918 and some of that pushback, say, by anti-maskers and others. But what economic historians have proven is that proactive measures for public health need not be, draconian and last forever. These lockdowns don't necessarily need to last forever to be effective. And in fact, the cities and states and counties that took those kinds of measures in 1918 and 19, and the ones that have most recently, bounce back economically as well. And so you can have partial openings. You can have an economy that's doing okay and be taking into account the public health of citizens and the wider population. It need not be an either or. And we need to step away from that kind of thinking, which is simple. It's sometimes very persuasive, but it's just flat out wrong in the historical record. And it has this kind of slippery slope logic, which is really problematic for democracy, because if you're pitting the economy versus people's deaths and disease, you've taken a really serious misstep. And that was something that was debated in 1918 and 19. And the mistakes that were made then are ones that we've tragically seen, in some states and cities in 2020 into 2021, and they need not be made again.
It's so important, and I'm going to double down on your doubling down and say that as a fellow historian, I can come up with very few examples of communities that ignored health or climate dangers and came out better for it. Just the opposite. Mm-hmm. Just the opposite. And I think that's an important reminder to all of us. Zachary, I know you've been involved in a lot of discussions. It's hard to avoid them. With other students, school administrators, and others about these exact issues surrounding what's appropriate to do, what's not. Should there be high school sports or not? Should people be in the classroom or at home? Does Chris's historical analysis help you to advance those conversations from where they are right now?
I think they do. I do think it's also particularly interesting when we're thinking about young people today, my generation, that we're really coming of age as learners, as students during this pandemic, which means that we're getting a lot more of the public health history and science than your generation did. And I think that's actually really key, because I think we have a lot more faith in these institutions of public health because we're having to interact with them from a very early age in a way that most Americans today did not have to.
It's a really good point. I mean, when you were going back to school in the spring, they took your temperature every day, right?
And even younger kids in elementary school, they are also interacting with this system. So I think hopefully we will come out of this experience with a greater faith in our institutions of public health, if not in our leaders.
Right. Chris, to sort of bring this to a close on an optimistic note, as we always like to, as you know, do you see this cause for optimism? Do you see this tragedy that we're living through having an important enlightening effect on us? And was there similar implications to the earlier pandemic of 1918, 1919?
Well, I think so. I can easily come up with a number of ways in which this pandemic is transformative. We've seen it be transformative in terms of our thinking about inequality, who is served by public health infrastructures, that marginalized people and those with lower socioeconomic status suffer more in pandemics. It's very clear. The nature of work has changed, so remote work is much easier. You alluded to technology. In 1918 and 19, people couldn't work from home. You either worked or you didn't work, right? And so in the wartime industries and some industries, there were 40% drops in who was working in the plants, not because they were all sick, but because they were making risk-benefit calculations and saying, I'm not going into work with this raging infectious disease around. So there are a number of vectors there. I think, students, jury's still out on what this generational dimension, will be. In 1918, the vast majority of people who died were 18 to 45, something possibly a half to 2/3. This pandemic has had the bulk of those deaths located at the 65 and over range. What does that say? I mean, I'm curious to know what Zachary would have to add there. What does that say about what the experience is? But some epidemiologists suggest that there's kind of generational impacts are more important when these pandemics hit the younger generations, because those who come through it or suffer through it are more transformed by it. So, the state of Pennsylvania, famously in 1918, there were 45,000 orphans. It was really a horrible hit to younger people, wage earners in that era. And one of the things coming out of that pandemic that we've heard a lot about that I think is also problematic is that there was an easy transition into the roaring 20s, so-called, right? That wasn't the case, or at least the roaring 20s weren't that roaring in the way that we tend to think. That's a simplistic rendering. There was inflation, there was the rise of the Klan and xenophobia, really draconian immigration restrictions, a kind of, inward-looking set of domestic politics, Calvin Coolidge's famous "The Business of America's Business" kind of logic, not a lot of looking out for fellow citizens, so we didn't learn a lot of those lessons. A contrast I often note is that, Canada developed a pretty robust Department of Public Health in 1919 because they realized their federal structures were not very good at dealing with pandemics. The U.S. did not. One of the things that historians often talk about is the U.S. really didn't centralize, the U.S. public health service with any policymaking power until much later. So, what lessons will we learn there? How should we prevent the next pandemic? Should we have a better strategic national stockpile? I mean, yes, obviously. What lessons have we learned about public-private in research and development for vaccines and being ready to go when a new infectious disease arrives? Because it's a when, not an if. But I do think there's some things here that are interesting about the nature of work, the nature of interactions, the possibilities for global exchange and interchange, and the fact that, we haven't mentioned it yet, but Black Lives Matter protests spanned the world during a pandemic. That would not have been something that many of us would have predicted, that mass gatherings were possible and weren't all super spreader events. So, I think activism thrived even in the midst of a pandemic is a fascinating theme to pull out, that the sort of thing that we historians will see in a generation and trace where it goes. And a lot of that is located in the younger generation, frankly, younger folks, partly because they had a higher risk tolerance and were less at risk. So that's an interesting piece of this puzzle too. Where is that going to go? As Zachary was implying, perhaps, where will this generation's experience of the pandemic lead them? Greater solidarity, more democratic activism? Will it be more atomistic? Will it be more individualistic? We're trapped in front of our Zoom, we're trying to get ours sort of thing. Unclear to me where that will go, but it seems very clear that the experience of the pandemic will be definitive in the lives of many school-age kids, people in high school, middle school, lower school, and college.
So well said, Chris. And I'll just add, and I think this might be a nice way to wrap up so many of your brilliant comments here. It seems to me that one big outcome of this has been a greater sensibility of how vulnerable our lives are, even those who are most privileged. And what that means, as you've already pointed out, for policy lessons and future activities is uncertain. But it's very hard to make the case now, especially to citizens of all ages who have lived through the last year and a half, that somehow Americans are invincible and somehow we have all the answers. Maybe that's not enough, but I do think that's quite a sea change, I think, from when you and I were Zachary's age, or when you and I were college students, or even when you and I were in our 20s, Chris, which wasn't that long ago, but it was a little while ago, right? And I think a certain humility, which I take from your own work, was an outcome of 1918, 1919. That generation, whether we like their politics or not, they had a sense of the limits of American power and the limits of American security that I think was lost to a later generation and maybe has been found again by this generation.
And I think if you go global with that there's another interesting dimension that, coming out of 1918, Woodrow Wilson would have had the U.S. in the League of Nations and would have had the U.S. participating in anti-pandemic efforts and anti-infectious disease efforts through the League of Nations, which the U.S. did not do. And is this a moment where a kind of global consensus could be reached on really fighting the collective challenges that face humanity, right? That talk about the fundamental democratic question of our era, climate change, and the kinds of things that transcend what any one nation state can do.
Chris, I think you've given our listeners an agenda, and you've displayed for us how the study of the past elucidates our world today. It doesn't offer simple recipes of any kind, and the differences are as great as the similarities, but the echoes and the experiences of the past help us to understand our own time better. And I do think they offer us some ways to think about what our democracy should look like going forward and the kinds of debates, the worthwhile debates and conversations we should be having, not the distractions that often take us off of our trajectory, I think. Chris, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today, and we hope to have you on again.
It's wonderful to be here, and thanks, Jeremy, and thanks, Zachary, for sharing your insights and your poetry.
Yes, Zachary, thank you for your pendulum metaphor for us for today that I think worked perfectly for our discussion. And thank you most of all to our listeners. Thank you for joining us for this week of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harris Codini.
Stay tuned for a new episode every week.
You can find This is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher.
See you next time.